3:17 a.m., my baby monitor whispered my daughter's name. The man beside the crib had already removed 3 of the 4 bolts holding it to the floor when he glanced toward the hidden camera. "You left her with machines again," he said. His voice was calm, almost disappointed. I was sitting inside an unmarked police van across the street, watching him on a monitor no larger than a dinner plate. Detective Lena Ortiz stood behind me with one hand pressed against her earpiece. No one in the van moved. The room on the screen had been built to resemble my daughter's nursery. Pale green walls. A white crib. A moon-shaped nightlight glowing beside the dresser. Even the pink blanket had been folded the way Sophie liked it, one corner tucked beneath her left arm. But Sophie was not in that crib. She was 12 miles away, asleep in a protected apartment with her father and 2 officers outside the door. The shape beneath the blanket was a weighted training doll. The man did not know that. He set his drill on the carpet and leaned over the crib. "There you are," he murmured. 2 fingers touched the doll's neck, as if he were checking for a pulse. Then he reached into his jacket and removed a small yellow inhaler. His hands were perfectly steady. That frightened me more than the drill. This was not someone acting on impulse. He had planned the route, packed supplies and chosen a place where he believed he could take my child without being interrupted. A child's car seat rested beside the wall. Next to it sat a duffel bag, and a folded blue coat that was too large for Sophie. Ortiz lowered her voice. "We need him to make the attempt. He's dismantling the crib. We need clear evidence that he intends to remove the child." I knew what she meant. I hated hearing it anyway. The man lifted the bundle just enough to slide one arm beneath it. The plastic head shifted unnaturally against his elbow. His face tightened. For 1 second, I thought he had discovered the trap. Then the speaker hidden behind the dresser came alive. My own voice filled the nursery. "Her name is Sophie." The man faced the sound. He did not seem surprised. He seemed annoyed. "That's what you named her," he replied. Ortiz gave the signal. The bedroom door opened behind him. He tightened both arms around the child-shaped bundle. 3 officers moved at once. The last thing visible before the camera shook was the man backing toward the window, shouting that the police were frightening his daughter. His daughter, not mine. To explain why a stranger believed my 3-year-old belonged to him, I have to go back 11 days. Back to the morning my baby monitor whispered Sophie's name at exactly 3:17. Before that night, my life was ordinary, in the way I had worked hard to make it ordinary. I was 42 and had spent 17 years as an army nurse. After Sophie was born, I left active duty and took a job at an outpatient surgical center outside Clarksville, Tennessee. Most evenings, I was home before bedtime. Sophie was 3, with dark curls, serious brown eyes, and a habit of pressing one hand against my cheek whenever she wanted my full attention. She still preferred her converted toddler crib to a regular bed. Her stuffed rabbit slept beneath her chin, and she liked one corner of the blanket tucked under her left arm. Her father, Mark, and I had been divorced for 8 months. There had been no affair and no single explosive ending. We had simply become better at managing schedules than talking to each other. Mark was a civil engineer. He was patient with Sophie, careful with money, and capable of cutting toast into stars without breaking a single point. He also avoided difficult conversations until silence became a decision of its own. We shared custody on a 3-4 schedule. Mark wanted alternating weeks. I thought 7 days away from either parent was too long for a 3-year-old. A mediation session was already scheduled. Neither of us called it a custody fight. That did not stop it from becoming one. The smart home equipment had been installed shortly after Sophie's first birthday, when I still worked occasional night shifts. The installer was a man named Evan Mercer. He stood out because of what happened when Sophie developed a cough during the installation. It was a minor cold. Evan paused beside the nursery wall and listened longer than seemed necessary. "Does she do that often?" "No. She's sick." From his pocket, he removed a faded hospital bracelet. The name Lily was printed across it in purple letters. "My daughter used to have trouble at night." Then he played a lullaby from his phone. Sophie stopped crying long enough to listen. At the time, it seemed kind. The night everything began, Mark was in Knoxville for a project inspection. He called Sophie before bed, made animal noises until she laughed, and promised to bring her a yellow construction truck. Before hanging up, he reminded me to review his proposed custody schedule. "I opened the email," I said. "That isn't the same as reading it. I read enough." "You always say that when you don't want to answer." Sophie threw her stuffed rabbit at the phone before the argument could grow. Mark laughed. So did I. For a moment, we sounded like the family we had once been. At 10:30, I locked the doors, armed the downstairs system, and went to bed. The baby monitor sat on my nightstand. At 3:17 a.m., it released a brief crackle of static. Then a man spoke my daughter's name. Sophie. My eyes opened. For one confused second, I thought Mark's video call had somehow reconnected. Then the voice returned. Sophie, don't cry. The words came through the monitor beside my bed. You'll be home soon. I was already in the hallway before my mind caught up with my body. Sophie's door stood halfway open. She was upright in the crib, crying so hard she could barely catch her breath. The nightlight glowed beside the dresser. The closet remained closed. No one was visible. I lifted her against my shoulder. Cold air touched the side of my face. The nursery window had been opened just enough to leave a narrow, dark line between the sash and frame. A safety stop prevented it from opening farther, without pressing a release tab. I had locked it before bed. Sophie clung to me while I carried her into the hallway. Only after checking that she was physically unharmed did I open the biometric safe in my bedroom. That order of events mattered later. I searched the house. Kitchen, laundry room, guest room, garage, closets. Every exterior door remained locked. The alarm still showed armed. No torn screen, broken latch, or footprint suggested anyone had entered from outside. At 3:26, I called 911. 2 patrol officers arrived 14 minutes later. By then, Sophie had stopped crying, but she would not release my shirt. The baby monitor stored short clips from the previous 12 hours. At 3:16:41, she was asleep. At 3:17:04, the recording became silent. Not distorted. Not interrupted by static. Silent. 47 seconds later, sound returned with Sophie screaming. The man's words were gone. I heard him, I told the officers. The older one kept his voice careful. I believe you heard something. That sentence stayed with me. He believed I had heard something. He did not yet believe someone had spoken. The security history showed that the nursery monitor had been opened remotely, moments before the audio disappeared. The account name attached to the access was Mark Grant Admin. Mark's old profile was supposed to have been disabled after he moved out. The officers asked whether we were fighting over custody. We're discussing a different schedule. Has he threatened to take her? No. Does he still have a key? No. I called him before sunrise. He answered from his hotel room in Knoxville. Someone spoke to Sophie through the monitor. What? I explained the missing audio, the open window, and his name appearing in the system. He did not deny anything immediately. Instead, he asked, "Could you recognize the voice?" No. Did he say my name? No. What about yours? No. A long breath came through the phone. Don't make an accusation until we know what happened. I didn't accuse you. You called me at 4 a.m. and told me my account was inside her room. Our daughter's room. Sophie lifted her head from my shoulder and raised one finger toward the round device mounted above the hallway. No, man, she said. I rubbed her back. What man, sweetheart? Her finger stayed raised. Man up there. Mark returned before noon. He came directly from Knoxville, in the same clothes he had worn the previous day. A dried coffee stain marked one cuff. By then, Detective Lena Ortiz was seated at my kitchen table. Mark placed his hotel receipt, parking records, and phone location history in front of her before being asked. A hallway camera at the hotel showed him entering his room at 10:52 p.m. His keycard was not used again until morning. He could not have been standing inside my house at 3:17. That did not explain why his name had appeared. After several questions, he admitted asking the security company to restore his old administrator access 3 weeks earlier. You reactivated an account connected to Sophie's room? I wanted to use the same equipment at my apartment. Who helped you? The original installer, Evan Mercer. Evan had restored the account and later visited Mark's apartment to add a door sensor. Mark had not told me because he thought the old house was no longer connected. I wasn't watching you, he said. I didn't say you were. You didn't have to. The detective recommended that Sophie sleep somewhere else until the equipment could be examined. Mark offered his apartment. My first instinct was to refuse, but the unexplained access had happened in my home. His apartment had already passed a basic inspection for mediation. I agreed to 2 nights. Sophie began crying when he lifted her. No daddy house. She's overwhelmed, Mark said. Near the door, he stopped. What have you asked her about this man? Almost nothing. She didn't create that idea by herself. His meaning was clear. He thought my fear had become hers. The next morning, Mark asked whether Sophie should remain with him until the investigation ended. I refused. He argued that his apartment had not been compromised. I reminded him that Evan had recently been inside it. Neither of us had proof. That should have put us on the same side. It did the opposite. 3 days later, I received notice of an emergency custody request. Mark had filed without warning me. The petition described how I had searched the house with a firearm after hearing a voice no one else could verify. It mentioned my military background, my light sleeping, and my habit of checking locks more than once. None of those details was invented. They had simply been rearranged until vigilance sounded like instability. Then Child Services received an anonymous report claiming I had left Sophie alone for 11 minutes. The electronic lock showed my phone leaving the home network and returning shortly afterward. The report did not mention that Sophie had been outside with me, wearing yellow rain boots and pushing a plastic lawnmower while I took the trash bin to the curb. At the temporary hearing, the judge did not declare either of us right. He said there was an unexplained security incident at my home and a concern that my reaction might be increasing Sophie's fear. Until the equipment was independently examined, Sophie would stay primarily with Mark. I would have daytime visits. No overnights. 14 days. That was all it took to turn me from her mother into a visitor. Outside the courthouse, Mark tried to explain. I wanted her somewhere secure. You could have asked for an investigation without using my history against me. You suspected me. I questioned your account. You treated me like I was involved, and you treated me like I was imagining it. Sophie was already buckled into the back seat. When she saw me, she reached toward the window. Mommy, come? Soon, baby. Her eyes moved upward. One finger pressed against her lips. Man listens. Mark did not answer. He raised the window and drove away. The first night without Sophie, I slept on the couch. At 3:17, I was awake. Nothing happened. An independent technician examined the house the following day. No forced entry. No damaged wiring. No obvious surveillance device. The monitor passed a standard test. Every room remained neat, quiet, and completely unhelpful. During my next visit with Sophie, a child therapist named Dr. Ruth Ellison observed us at a family services office. We built towers from wooden blocks. Sophie laughed each time she knocked one down. Then a speaker near reception made an electronic chime. The block slipped from her hand. Mommy sleeps hard. Who says that? Her eyes rose toward the round alarm overhead. Man. I stopped there. The following day, Dr. Ellison showed me the phrases she had recorded. Man listens. Mommy sleeps hard. No daddy house. She associates him with something above her, she said. Possibly a device. The round unit above the nursery dresser came to mind. What changed in that room before the incident? Nothing. Any repair visit. 6 weeks earlier, the system had reported a fault. An email claimed the nursery sensor had been replaced while I was at work. Mark let someone in. Find out who. At home, I searched the old service emails. One invoice listed a technician code. At the bottom was a note I had never seen. Customer reports child sleeps better with increased airflow. Window safety limit calibrated to 2 inches. I had never made that request. Neither had Mark. The security company agreed to meet with the detective and me the next morning. The technician code belonged to Evan Mercer. He had never been officially assigned to my house that day. The device above Sophie's dresser had also been altered. The manager gave us the only explanation that mattered. Evan had installed equipment that allowed him to hear what happened in the nursery and send his own voice through nearby speakers. Could he have spoken to her that night? I asked. Yes. Could he interfere with the recording? Yes. A man had stood in our home, shown me his daughter's hospital bracelet, and installed a way to listen to mine. The same discovery cleared Mark. Evan had entered through the profile Mark recently restored, causing the activity to appear under his name. There was barely time to absorb that before investigators found another altered device at Mark's apartment. We drove there immediately. A technician removed the new door sensor from the wall. Beneath its ordinary plastic cover sat a hidden microphone. Mark stood beside the kitchen counter while it was sealed in an evidence bag. I brought him here. You didn't know. I knew I wanted the apartment to look better for mediation. That was why he had contacted Evan. The detective asked whether Evan had shown unusual interest in Sophie. He asked which room she used, Mark said. Then he asked whether she still had breathing problems. She never did. I told him that. A speaker near the television chimed. A piano lullaby began playing. Mark's phone rested on the counter. Mine was in my hand. Down the hall, a window started to move. Sophie cried out. Mark reached her first. She clung to his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. No more song. Technicians recovered 6 seconds of sound from the speaker. A little girl sang the first line of the lullaby. Then a man prompted her. Again, Lily. The name led investigators to an obituary. Evan's 4-year-old daughter had died 6 years earlier after a severe asthma attack. A photograph showed him holding her outside a hospital. The faded bracelet circled his wrist. It was the same one he had shown me. After her death, Evan had begun requesting work involving nurseries and child safety systems. Several customers later complained that he asked personal questions or stayed longer than necessary. No one had accused him of a crime. He had returned to my property twice without an official assignment. One visit was the unauthorized sensor replacement. The other happened while Sophie and I were at the grocery store. My doorbell camera showed his van outside for 19 minutes. That evening, I sat alone beside the crib. The house was quiet. No static. No lullaby. Only the air conditioner running through a room where a stranger had stood while I was buying milk. Evan came to the station voluntarily the next afternoon. He wore a clean work shirt and carried copies of his certifications. He claimed the altered equipment must have been installed by mistake. Someone else, he suggested, had used his access. Then the detective asked about the nursery window. Did you change its setting? No. Do you know how far it opened? No. The gap was about 2 inches. He nodded before thinking. That's the standard sleep ventilation setting. There was no such standard. The mistake crossed his face a second too late. Behind the observation glass, I waited for someone to stop him from leaving. No one did. His answer proved that he knew about the window. It did not prove he had spoken through the monitor, or intended to take Sophie. He walked out of the station, smoothing the front of his shirt, as if the interview had been an inconvenience. 2 days later, a judge approved a limited search of Evan's recent records. One address appeared repeatedly: a rented farmhouse outside Hopkinsville. Utility service had begun 3 months earlier, even though Evan's driver's license still listed his apartment in Clarksville. Police could not enter the property yet. They could watch it. A surveillance team saw him carry in boxes from a children's furniture store. Another delivery included a crib mattress. The farmhouse windows were covered, but a pale green paint can sat beside the back steps. The detective showed me the photographs. He's preparing a room, she said. For whom? She did not answer. She did not need to. The farmhouse changed the case, but it still did not tell us when he planned to act. That answer arrived the same evening. A padded envelope had been left outside Mark's apartment. Inside was a photograph of Sophie asleep in the small bedroom. The picture had been taken from high on the wall, near the hidden device. Written on the back were 2 lines. You keep moving her. She needs one home. Mark held the photograph by its edges. I gave him this address. You thought he was installing security equipment. I also used what happened against you. There was no time to settle what that meant for us. Sophie was moved to a protected apartment while investigators examined every device we owned. I returned to my empty house. At 3:06 a.m., the nursery nightlight switched on by itself. The temperature dropped. 11 minutes later, a faint click came from the unit above the dresser. Evan's voice filled the room. You make her afraid of me. I recorded from the hallway. She remembers the song. I remained silent. You keep choosing work, court, police. His tone held no panic, only judgment. I can give her quiet. The connection ended. When the detective heard the recording, the remaining doubt disappeared. He intends to take her. I stood beside Sophie's empty crib. Then we give him a place to try. The neighboring house had been vacant for months and shared the same floor plan as mine in reverse. With the owner's permission, police turned it into a controlled location. A moving truck arrived outside my home the next morning. Officers dressed as movers carried boxes, a duplicate crib, and nursery furniture into the empty property. A rental sign appeared in the yard. From the street, it seemed that Sophie and I were relocating. The main control unit from my home was transferred next door. To anyone monitoring it remotely, Sophie's nursery had simply moved. Inside, police recreated the room with pale green walls, a moon-shaped lamp, and a pink blanket. Sophie was nowhere near the property. A weighted training doll rested in the crib. I wanted to wait inside the house. The answer was immediate. You are not confronting him. He expects me to be there. He expects you to be asleep. I know how he speaks to her. And you are the one person in this operation who cannot stay detached if he touches that crib. She was right. We settled on placing me in the command van across the street, with access to a hidden speaker. For nearly 3 hours, nothing happened. Every passing car tightened the silence inside the van. At 2:38 a.m., a gray utility vehicle rolled past with its lights off. A figure entered the backyard and opened the exterior service panel. Seconds later, the electronic lock disengaged. Evan stepped inside, carrying a child's car seat. He crossed the house without hesitation and entered the nursery. For almost a minute, he stood beside the crib, listening to the artificial breathing beneath the blanket. There you are. He placed a yellow inhaler on the dresser, then a blue coat, a pair of shoes, children's medicine. He had packed everything Sophie might need. Evan inspected the bolts securing the crib to the floor and opened a tool roll. The drill removed the first anchor, then the second. Each bolt went into a plastic bag, as though he intended to rebuild the crib at the farmhouse. You don't need this place, he told the covered figure. She fills every room with alarms. The third bolt came free. I pressed the microphone button. Her name is Sophie. He faced the hidden speaker. That's what you named her. You are not her father. You don't know what a father is supposed to notice. His voice sharpened. You slept through her breathing. I heard you. Too late. He slid his arms beneath the doll. Where are you taking her? Home. The farmhouse. For the first time, he hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. You went inside, he said. No. You had no right. Neither did you. His grip tightened around the bundle. You ruined it. Put her down. She isn't safe with you. She isn't there. He pulled back the blanket. The doll's plastic face tilted toward him. For a moment, he did not move. Then his attention snapped toward the dresser. He found the hidden camera. The calm disappeared. You moved her. The signal was given. Officers entered from the hallway and the concealed closet. Evan dropped the doll onto the mattress and lunged toward the window. An officer caught the back of his coat, but he tore free and slammed both hands against the glass. The safety latch held. He spun around. Hands where we can see them. Evan grabbed the duffel bag and threw it across the room. Medicine bottles, clothes, and photographs scattered over the carpet. The brief confusion allowed him to reach the hallway. 3 steps. That was as far as he got. Another officer blocked the stairs. Evan backed into the nursery, breathing hard. You don't know where she is. A voice came through the speaker. Sophie is safe. No. She is with her father. No. Both hands pressed against the sides of his head. He doesn't listen. He is with her. He moves her. She cries. Neither of them hears what she needs. I leaned toward the microphone. You do not know my daughter. His face angled toward the dresser. I know which song settles her. You frightened her with it. I kept her safe. You watched her sleep. She needed someone. You needed her to be someone else. His eyes narrowed. You studied Sophie until you could pretend she was your daughter. Don't talk about her. The officers moved closer. Evan seized the crib rail and pulled it sideways. With 3 anchors removed, the frame tilted sharply. The doll rolled against the bars. He grabbed it again. For one disturbing moment, he cradled the plastic body against his chest, as if the truth in front of him no longer mattered. Give her back. No one moved. Then he tried to push past the nearest officer while still holding the doll. 2 officers caught his arms. Evan fought to keep hold of it. The pink blanket twisted around his wrists as they forced him toward the floor. She can't breathe, he shouted. You're crushing her. The doll fell from his arms. Its head struck the carpet with a hollow plastic sound. Evan stopped resisting. One wrist was secured, then the other. He raised his face toward the hidden camera. You used her. I pressed the button one final time. No, you did. After the arrest, police entered the farmhouse. The room at the back had pale green walls, a white crib, children's books, and a moon-shaped lamp identical to Sophie's. A child's name had once been painted above the bed. It had been covered with a new wooden sign. Sophie. Evan's work tablet contained recordings from both homes. Mark reading bedtime stories. Sophie playing in her room. Me checking on her during the night. The missing 47 seconds from the baby monitor was still stored there. The complete recording captured Evan saying her name, playing the lullaby and promising to take her home. The anonymous report to Child Services had come from him as well. He had altered the household information to make it appear that I left Sophie unattended. He had not only prepared a bedroom, he had prepared a reason to believe she belonged there. In his version, Mark and I were careless parents who kept passing her between unstable homes. He was the only person paying enough attention. During a later interview, the detective placed a photograph of his daughter in front of him. Her medical records show that she received emergency care, she said. No one ignored her. Evan turned the photograph face down. Her mother didn't hear her soon enough. The records did not support that. But he needed someone to blame. Without blame, her death was something he could not repair. Sophie had become his chance to rewrite the ending. You planned to take her to the farmhouse. I planned to let her sleep, without either parent. They leave her all the time. That sentence was enough for me. I stepped away from the observation window. Mark was waiting in the hallway. I still filed that petition, he said. You were afraid. I used your past because it made my argument easier. He did not soften it. He did not ask me to forgive him. 4 days later, the temporary custody order was reviewed. Mark withdrew every claim suggesting I was unstable. The neglect report was closed. Our previous parenting schedule was restored, with counseling required before either of us could request another change. Near the courthouse elevators, Mark stopped me. I believed the version of you that helped me win. You knew me better. I did. And you used it anyway. Yes. The elevator doors opened. Neither of us stepped inside. We're not going back to what we were, I said. I know. We did not reconcile. We learned how to co-parent without turning fear into evidence against each other. Evan later pleaded guilty to surveillance, burglary, stalking, and attempted kidnapping. The following spring, Sophie and I moved. The new house was smaller and closer to Mark's apartment. It had ordinary locks, separate smoke alarms, and no connected monitoring system. Sophie chose a room with yellow walls. She had outgrown the crib, so Mark and I assembled a wooden bed together. We attached one side backward, lost a screw, and argued about the instructions. It was the first normal disagreement we had shared in a long time. For several months, Sophie asked whether the man could hear us in the new house. My answer never changed. No. One night, I woke and checked the clock. 3:17 a.m. A moment later, Sophie called from her room. Mommy? She only wanted water. I brought her a cup, tucked the blanket beneath her arm, and stayed until she fell asleep. Before leaving, I checked the window. Locked. Then I turned off the light. Months later, Sophie stopped asking whether someone was listening. Because finally, no one was. If this story kept you listening, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.